All right. So I believe we're live. Can y'all hear?
I can hear you. Oh, looks like the Shiv Shack is back.
Hey! All right. Just to give you guys an idea of what we're going to be talking about this time, the overall, I guess, the broad topic is what makes a butterfly knife good for flipping, right? And this is definitely something that 50 Blades of Gray is going to be providing more insight on, just because I don't know a whole lot about flipping. We will be doing a similar topic, basically covering all the same stuff, but for what makes a butterfly knife high quality. So I know that some people might have some questions, oh, well, in regards to the quality of something, like how something impacts the quality. But we're going to save most of those questions for a future stream. This is just based on what makes it flip well. But we're going to have a slight tangent here at the beginning, because it's something I've wanted to say for a very long time, which is, well, first off, Unix-based systems are just objectively better than anything that's DOS or NT-based. Completely. And you can say, oh, well, that's an anecdote. And, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. True, I don't know what I'm talking about. But what I do know is, over the past 10 or, 15 years now, I've had to reinstall Windows so many times that I cannot count. It just becomes cluttered, clogged, slow, it crashes, stuff stops working, over and over again. It's like I leave USB drives with Windows install media on them around because of this. That's how bad it is. In that time, I have had to reinstall, do a complete wipe and reinstall Mac OS probably once or twice. I remember one time in particular where I actually was like, this isn't good. And I was at the point where I was trying to save whatever data I could. But I cannot emphasize quite how awful Windows is. And nothing frustrates me more than incompetence like that. If your job, if your goal is to create a good operating system and it's just that much worse, come on, dude. Anyway, that's
Preach.
Oh my god.
Let the man preach.
I'm absolutely infuriated right now that I'm sitting there editing a text file on a brand new install of Windows. All other external and internal drives are shut off, and somehow it manages to completely freeze. And then when I try to boot it again, it takes me 15 minutes to finally get it to boot. It's just ridiculous. So anyway, you want to go through the outline? You have the outline up?
I have that pulling up right now. There we go. So I don't know, we can kind of walk through it step by step, unless you want to just kind of run down all the talking points right now.
Let's do that. Just, so people have an idea of what the layout is going to be, what's to come.
Perfect. So for what makes Balisong a good flipper, we're going to be looking at construction. So that means sandwich versus channel. The construction, as in, does it have liners? Is it a single slab? Zen pins versus Tang pins. The pivot system, so that means washings, bushings, bearings. How's that pivot system set up? How weight affects it? How balance point affects it? Length, width. There are considerations for the blade shape, how comfortable that is. Same thing goes for handles, shape. How's that comfort feel? We'll even talk about latches, very controversial. And we will even talk about the sharpness of the blade, although this is not quite as critical for the flippability, but it is something to consider.
Right, and we will be doing 2 separate streams addressing sharpness. one of them like the impact of sharpness on, you know, like cuts and stuff like that, and then a completely separate one when it comes to actually sharpening a knife and the geometry of the edge and all that, because that's something I know some people have had some interest in and I love to talk about. So yeah.
Yeah, very, very, very exciting stuff. So if you're good, I think we can just break right into it, or cut right into it, pun intended. So
I'm down.
the construction, how does that affect flipping? And I know there's a decent number of opinions out there. For me, this one is in the critical category. So I know there's kind of a crowd that idealizes channel construction. Why do they do that? Well, I can't blame them. The 42 was the have to have it knife for so many years, and that was channel construction. Later on, you have the 51. You have, I don't know if the Tachyon 2 came out afterwards, after the 42, but many of the Balisongs after the 42 were sandwich construction, as far as I could tell. Even the Alpha Beast, Replicant, those are sandwich construction, and they took a little while to kind of get popular. And now I feel like today sandwich construction is way more accepted. But for years, I feel like channel was the go-to, and even with the Alpha Beast, and even with the 87, there was a callback to channel construction. There was a demand for it, and to whatever degree those fulfilled those demands, we could talk about that, but not too pertinent here. There was a demand, but I feel like nowadays you can make an argument for sandwich or channel construction being acceptable for a flipper. I know some people might have differing opinions about that, but realistically, I don't feel like that's the thing. That's not the hill to die on. I don't know if you have any
Right.
thoughts on that.
Well, I think, and one of the things we had talked about is like making sure to like compartmentalize things, right? Like obviously well, I guess we could add this, right? Like handle play. Let's put that later on down
That's
here.
a good one, yeah.
But to separate handle play from like the construction, okay? Because there's definitely an impact there. And I would say my guess is that if you're just talking about which is more comfortable, sandwich is probably more comfortable. And it gives you an extra point of reference about where the handle is in terms of rotation, right? But,
I surprisingly, I don't agree. So I think it actually comes down to the choices made on how is that handle milled, what are those scales made of, if there are scales. Just general, even bead blast, it could come down to bead blast versus stonewash. Those choices, I think, matter way more than from a flipping perspective. Just from a flipping perspective only, I think those choices make a much bigger impact than just if it's made out of two pieces versus one. Maybe there could be some arguments for tolerance, but yeah, I'm not feeling that.
well, there is, and maybe, so, okay. I might just be kind of biased here because I sort of tend to look at these things from the perspective of someone who's like machining it. And as far as I'm concerned, there's almost nothing that's better about a channel knife compared to sandwich. And did I mix up channel and sandwich before? I meant to say channel was more comfortable.
I think you were pro channel, and then you started.
You're right. No. I think that, in my opinion, channel would be more comfortable. However, from the perspective of tolerances and machining it and stuff, it's very, very difficult to argue that channel is better. It just is. We can go into that in a lot more depth in like a more dedicated stream to that, but just take my word for it for now.
Actually, we can talk about that later, but that did actually make me think of one this is probably the biggest place that you can argue that channel could be beneficial, and that is if you're aggressively flipping the knife. So what I mean by that is if you're dropping it on hardwood floors, concrete, whatever, it's probably going to hold up a fair bit better than a sandwich construction, mainly because there's less screws to worry about. So if you plan on beating on a knife, I think that's the main argument I would make for pro channel as opposed to sandwich. But in terms of the overall effect of performance, I would put it on a low personal preference basis.
Well, one thing and I'm not super confident on this, but I don't think that the screws would really be impacted by dropping on a sandwich any more than on a channel. And the reason for that is generally with the way that, like when you tighten screws down like that, at least when it comes to like sex bolts and stuff, the screw is not there to hold it in place, like from like a shear load or something. What it does is it essentially is just creating a bunch of friction, and that friction is what is holding it in place. And that's how it is with a lot of fasteners. Is you don't actually want the fastener to be withstanding any of the force. Really, you want static friction and stuff to do that, unless you even have like something specifically constructed like a ledge, which would be even better. But I don't know that it would make that much of a difference. But if you use low quality screws or something, or if you've had issues with it in the past, then I might just be looking at this from like I do kind of, I'm very picky about what screws that I use.
I guess I've just noticed that, and it could be a bias, but to me, it seems like you have a higher chance of a sandwich construction knife falling apart before a channel. Like if I was to stand on top of a building and launch a sandwich construction knife off it, launch channel construction off the top of that building, I feel like most times, assuming quality is the same, the channel's gonna win. It's gonna
I
outlast.
agree. I think you're
So
right.
that is where I'd make the argument for pro channel. Otherwise, I'm very hard pressed outside of an aesthetic argument to say that sandwich versus channel makes a big difference outside of just that abuse topic.
All right, and I guess I didn't put this in here because I don't want to go into a ton of detail, but there is chandwich, but that's kind of its
That's
own.
interesting.
Yeah,
The
and
bastard child.
right, and the reason I took it out is it's like it really, the only difference between that and channel is like it would only be relevant in the context of like quality in a sense, because it has to do with tolerances and stuff. So I don't think it's all that relevant. I would just, for the purposes of this this live stream, consider chandwich and channel to be the same thing. And that's my proposal. Would you agree?
Yeah, you could say functionally. Well, I don't know about functionally, but I'm not gonna die on that hill. Yeah, I don't have any strong preference on exactly where to classify it. Chandwich is probably the best way to describe it, but aside from that,
All right. Now, how about scale and liner construction versus slab construction?
now this is where I think it gets a little bit better. So if you're talking about just a single piece of metal making up that handle, and whether that is sandwich or channel, so two pieces of metal or just one milled out piece of metal, um, or you take the basically what you'd be making. It's kind of like it's a sandwich on a sandwich, really, because you have your two base pieces of metal or whatever else you want there, and then you have typically either G10, micarta, carbon fiber. In some cases, I have seen metal on top of metal, so titanium on top of titanium.
Like my 51 scales.
Yeah, like those, like Flightanium could be an example, or the ones that you make. That's an example of metal on metal. So there's a lot of variation there, and I think it comes down mostly to exactly what materials we're talking about. So, at least in terms of metal, you're typically looking at titanium, stainless steel, or and I think this might be another discussion point, but it is applicable. It's definitely applicable to the scales and aligners. Um, and then aluminum.
Oh God,
Oh no.
I need a trigger warning next time on that.
We need a little a flashing light to go off to notify you.
Right.
So those are the most common metals. I have seen some examples of brass, but those are like from the 80s and not really applicable anymore. I mean, I
Very
guess
uncommon.
yeah, I guess if someone wanted to make it out of it, they could, but that's such a rarity right now. So you have the metals, and then you have, like I said, you have your G10s, your micarta, carbon fiber, could be metal on top of metal, but those are typically going to be your scales. And how either that Balisong company, manufacturer, custom maker, how they put those together makes a pretty big difference in my opinion. So I would not want someone to make a Balisong for flipping and decide in their genius mind that they're going to have G10 liners with stainless steel scales. That is a choice that would be absolutely, for me, a no-go. I would not want to have some softer type of material on the inside and have a harder material like stainless steel on the outside.
Well, G10 and stuff are actually not necessarily soft. They're just composite, and they're not really meant to be withstanding loads of that type.
Thank you for that correction.
They'd
Because
be
yeah,
more likely to shatter, basically, or like delaminate, really.
Or could they have a higher tendency to bend as well?
Generally with like composites, like especially carbon fiber, it doesn't flex a whole lot. It just breaks all of a sudden, right? So if you have like a carbon fiber airframe or something, it generally won't. I mean, and you can. There's exceptions. Like you can build it in certain ways. Like you can look at the wings of the 787, and they're incredibly flexible, right? But as far as like as a rigid structure, it doesn't flex the same way that like titanium would. It'll just break.
Okay.
That's
All
my
right.
understanding. Like, I'm sure there's going to be some engineer that listens to this and like, dude, this guy's an idiot. And yes, you're correct, but I'm just doing the best I can. Okay.
We're gonna get annihilated in the reviews
Oh
of
God.
this video. Can't
Yeah.
wait for that feedback.
Yeah.
But to continue down that point, in the same breath, I would not want someone and I Balisongs like this exist. I know they do because you can go online and search for them. I would not want the uh, what am I? How am I wording this? If it was just to be only liner, so there's no scales, just an only liner sandwich construction or only liner channel construction, I would not want that to be just G10.
How is there only a liner that just becomes a slab?
A slab. Sorry, yeah, that's the better way to describe it. So just two slabs of G10 comprising the handle. It's gonna be a hard no for me, and that's because, and it ties back into the ability to withstand damage. It If you're just putting it on top of carpet, if you're just gonna flip over carpet, that's fine. But if you're taking it outside and it's hitting any hard surface, that G10 is going to get eaten up. Maybe not quickly, but it's going to get eaten up far faster than something like titanium or stainless steel. I won't put aluminum in that category of of strong to withstand damage because aluminum gets annihilated pretty hard too.
Well, the real problem with aluminum isn't necessarily like the strength of it. It has to do with the fatigue properties of it. And so it doesn't make a good liner material because essentially yeah. If you look at, cases where you repeatedly put aluminum even under a small amount of stress, it causes fatigue. Whereas there is a fatigue limit on other materials where it doesn't really cause any appreciable fatigue if it is not above a certain amount of deformation or whatever. But I think the problem you would have with using just an all G10 slab is, and it doesn't matter if you use Zen pins or you're using Tang pins, I think you would eventually have the different layers delaminate and start to deform. And if it's up by the pivots or something, then it could start binding and the handles would start to potentially touch, like Fiore knives or something.
The pinless, yeah.
God, yeah.
Well, yeah, but that's something people, and this is actually, we're almost there. We're almost going to get to that point, because this point about scale, liner, slab construction very much ties into making a decision about Zen pin versus Tang pin. And the important thing to keep in mind here is that no single characteristic is going to completely define a knife. Now, if we're talking extremes, like say you make the entire balisong out of
Water.
stainless, yeah, yeah, if it's made out of water. But more realistically, let's say you make an entire balisong out of stainless steel. The handles are extremely thick. You add stainless steel spacers, because why not? And that's your balisong. You just got two slabs on each side forming that sandwich construction. That's going to be on the extreme of maybe that one characteristic can define the knife, but typically that's not going to be what happens. More often than not, it's going to be a mixture of these characteristics that will indicate to you whether or not that balisong that you're looking at, maybe you're thinking about buying it, if it's going to flip well, or if it indicates that it's going to be a poor performer. So to wrap up the liner plus scale, or slab only, I would say that typically it's going to come down to the materials used. You can have a fantastic slab only balisong, so that would be something like your Alpha Beast as an example, or you could have a fantastic liner plus scale. And as someone, and I like this one as well, the carbon fiber replicant is honestly a pretty good example of that. You can make an argument for the 51 if you wanted to, but you can have two good knives using these different constructions, but the materials used do matter. In the Alpha Beast example, you have titanium. In the carbon fiber replicant, it's a titanium liner with a carbon fiber scale. In the 51 example, titanium liner, G10 scale. So there's variance among it, but when you take this factor into consideration along with others, you can make a more educated decision about if a balisong is likely to be a good flipper.
One last thing I'd like to add, because it does kind of relate to the next topic as well. So, hey, it's a good transition. Look at me. I'm being productive. Which is, a lot of people will tell you Tang pins are less bouncy than Zen pins. And that is true. But the number one thing is it a liner and scale construction, or is it a slab? Because if you look at the liners of, like, for example, the 51, right? You can actually see that they displace, like they curve under the force that when it's latched or whatever, the liner is actually bent. And that's even more noticeable when you don't have Zen pin screws. Although I still think really you wouldn't have that much of a difference without the Zen pin screws. But the biggest impact is actually not Tang pin versus Zen pin. It has to do with, does it use Zen pins with a liner setup, or is it a slab and Zen pin or whatever? So
yeah, the bounciness is something I hear talked about, and it's never been a make or break factor for me. And I do think it's one of those things that has variance among materials used, or even the shapes involved as well. I think the bigger argument is it ties back to longevity of the knife. So if you have, and many companies have made this mistake, many companies who I thought would know better than to make this mistake have made this mistake. Tang pins. If you have a Tang pin balisong and the handles are made of aluminum, those handles are going to lose that war.
Yes,
What I mean,
by and large. However, one thing I would say is if you actually properly design the knife, it's not as much of an issue, because if the actual contact point between the Tang pin and the slab is concave instead of just contacting on the side, then it's going to require a lot more force to displace it further than if it's just starting to create an indent on the flat side.
oh, that I agree with, but I would say, kind of to challenge that, if you took that same handle and same Tang pin and you replaced it with like titanium and everything else was the same, all dimensions were the same, that titanium is going to hold up better.
For multiple reasons, actually. Titanium is it's actually incredibly springy while retaining its shape, which is why it's used in braces and stuff. You know, and aluminum is sort of not known for its, you know, hardness.
Yes, it's certainly not. When I think about aluminum, I typically think of a soda can and how easy it is to bend that.
Yeah, like I've just started chewing aluminum instead of bubblegum.
but the point is, and I hate to kind of have to bring in other characteristics, but it really does matter. If you said Tang pin versus Zen pin, I can't make an educated decision on that quality alone unless you are really, really dead set on having that particular configuration. I wouldn't know. You could show me an amazing Tang pin flipper, and I'd look at it and say, that looks amazing. But you could just as well show me one that I know is going to not hold up well. There, but there's even been, and not even just like the handle material, but sometimes the actual quality, and I know this is a discussion point for later, but there's been examples of Tang pins falling out on some balisongs. So it's just so hard on just Zen pin versus Tang pin to make a decision unless you take other factors into consideration.
It comes
With
down to the quality of the design. And just in case anybody's unsure, the Tang pins are supposed to remain in the knife even after a year, just in case there's confusion or whatever.
you'd have to be really abusing that knife for the Tang pin. I mean, there's been examples of a lemon every now and then, but unless you're abusing that knife, they should stay in there.
Right. One person just asked, do you guys prefer the Archangel or are you 4X fans? You know where I'm gonna fall on that, so where would you fall?
To answer that question, what's hilarious about it is I haven't flipped either. I can't I can't make some educated guesses about them though. So from just like looking at the cutouts in the Archangel handles versus the 42, considering that, and actually I'm actually not sure, is the Archangel channel or sandwich? I'm pretty sure.
Sorry, go on.
I thought it was sandwich, but I'm like, is it?
I
Is
thought
it
it was
actually?
channel.
It might, if it's channel, I'd actually have a little bit harder of a time here making a decision. Honestly, I want to say that I know, but I feel like the Archangel is probably a little bit lighter and a little bit more floaty. Just looking at it and knowing what general things I know about it, I feel like the 42 is still floaty because it's titanium, and it's got a bunch of holes through the handles. But Oh man.
I'm definitely a fan of the 42 Springer any day of the week.
I would honestly probably need to flip them to make that call.
Well, that's why it's so easy for me. I just don't flip.
Well, because like I look at them, and even if you look at them on paper, they both suggest that they're going to perform pretty well, weight wise, length wise, and these are topics. These are topics we're gonna get to, but length wise, weight wise, materials used, textures, both suggest they're going to be pretty good.
Right.
So, unfortunately, I don't have an answer, but I would want to flip both of them. I'll put that out there.
Now for the pivot system, washers, bushings, bearings, nothing. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have seen nothing designs before, and I have flipped nothing. Just handle on blade contact. Surprisingly, it's not the worst, but I would say from a flipping perspective, and I have tried bearings. I have tried that. I have tried bushings, and I have tried just washer contact. With all that in mind, I prefer bushings the most.
And
I
why is
think
that?
I think they offer a good mixture of tolerance control along with allowing the handle to swing pretty damn freely. However, you could say, "Oh, but bearings allow the handle to swing pretty freely." A little too freely. A little way too freely sometimes. To me, for a battle song to flip well, I would like there to be some resistance that I can tighten or loosen as much as I want, and it still retain just a little bit of resistance. Because if you have a super floaty handle, that thing, I don't know. Sometimes it whips around way too quick for me to comfortably flip it. And by comfortably flip it, I mean predict how fast that thing's actually going to come around. And I know it could be, well, just get good. Well, yeah, but I could get good, or I could just use a system that makes it easier for me instead of putting effort into really trying to hone in on how a bearing battle song flips. And I've seen people make arguments for it, but it's not for me.
Yeah, I would say with my limited experience, I would prefer bushings, although I think washers is definitely, I don't have that much of a problem with it. Which
Yeah,
I
it's
guess
still fine. Yeah.
just because somebody asked in chat, I want to be, I'm sure this is going to upset a lot of people. Needlessly, let's be like, why would they get upset over this? But I'll say it anyway. Spending a ton of money on a brand name lube for knife pivots, okay, is ridiculous when you can buy a product that's arguably better in much greater quantities for a lot less. It's kind of like, you know, yeah, if you
Could always
actually,
just spit on it.
hmm? Oh,
Said you
yeah,
could
yeah,
always
yeah.
just spit on it. I mean, it's
Right.
not rocket science here.
Well, I think as long as you have like a decent quality lubricant and you're not getting a bunch of dust in it, it's, you know, you're fine. But I would caution people against buying into the hype of certain products. Um,
Oh, hype is, and boy, that's a great topic for a later time. Hype and the battle song community go hand in hand.
right.
I know it goes hand in hand with a lot of communities, but I guess when you're looking for it, you see it more easily.
Yeah. I think that, you know, I don't know. I guess in my opinion that, yes to the guy with the purple username. Um, you know, it comes down to like, what are you actually spending your time and money on as a company, right? Like, I know that I'm a little bit unconventional with what I do, which is just like, I literally spend no money on advertising or anything like that. Like, I just spend that time trying to make stuff better, and then I just hope that the increase in quality will lead to people spreading it just by word of mouth, right? And it's been quite successful so far in that respect. But there are other companies that are just like, they'll buy something that's like probably lubricant for yo-yos or something, and they buy it from China and they slap a label on it, and then they spend the rest of their money on advertising or convincing kids to post about it on their stories or whatever. And it's like, I don't, you know, I guess I'm biased because of my own outlook on it, but I would caution people against buying into that kind of stuff.
And just to actually tie that into flipping, really, and I know it's more about what lube, or at least I think the question was about what lube you could use, but even I've used a lot of ballast songs for a lot of flipping, and there's been neglect in terms of the lubrication department in a number of cases. And the negatives I've seen have been relatively low. I don't really feel like the quality of flipping is diminished that greatly. Again, it ties back into, for me, sometimes having a little bit of resistance isn't a bad thing for flipping. It allows me to more easily control the knife exactly how I want to, or at least how I hope I how I hope I want to.
Right. Yeah, I think lubricant sort of is like, on some level, it's just an aspect of how you maintain the knife. It's not necessarily super connected to how well any particular knife flips. Like, to make that argument, you'd have to say that something about, you know, each different knife impacts the effect that the lubricant has on it. And I think that's kind of a tough argument to make.
You're going
you've
down
got,
it's a deep rabbit hole.
right.
It's very deep.
And it's not so much based on the knife, unless you've got some serious problems with the knife. So,
All right, what do we have next here? It looks like weight, and I
well,
alluded
we didn't
to
really
this.
cover handle play. We covered the pivot system, and we covered, I guess, the effects that it has. But I don't. And we talked about lubricant in terms of how quick the handles are, but you didn't talk, as far as I'm aware, about actually your thoughts on handle play. And I the reason I say that is because I didn't hear the word tap come up at all.
Oh, geez. Yeah,
So
let's do a mini rant
go for
on
it.
handle play and tap and the allegations that people make about tap.
Very serious allegations, I might
Yeah,
add.
these are very serious allegations. There is a group of individuals out there who propose that tap can absolutely ruin the performance of a ballast song.
Absolutely ruin.
And I almost feel like these people know that they do not flip that well. And so they come up with these fanciful arguments about, oh, tap is no good, tap is bad, to justify the fact that they really don't know what the hell they're talking about when it comes to flipping. They just do not understand that handle play is going to happen. Yes, I would like my ballast song to have very good tolerances. But I think anyone is lying to themselves if they don't think that when that knife falls on the ground, even if it's carpet, that there's a very good chance that that blade is going to go tap the side of the handle and kind of slowly chip away at the tolerances until you redo it, and then it'll slowly chip away until you redo it. I don't know what problem people are trying to solve with tap and flipping. The only time I feel like it's a important factor is if you're looking at a collector ballast song that someone wants in the most pristine of pristine condition. Otherwise, if you're talking about handle play, you can have some disgusting levels of handle play and that knife will still flip well. I have seen absolutely disgusting amounts of play on 42s before, and then someone still performs good tricks on them. So I really do think it's a problem that is exaggerated, especially within flipping. And I would like to challenge that ridiculous notion and allegations because they are ridiculous and they're mostly unfounded because people who flip understand that handle play isn't really going to affect how that knife flips that much, if at all. And in fact, you could even make the argument that handle play allows you to make slightly more mistakes because that handle isn't going to be dead set locked into a certain path. It could be a little bit off one way or another, and when you catch it, even when you catch it, you could be a little bit misplaced in where you are, but the balisong will right itself, as opposed to if it's just perfect tolerances, it's on that path. You're gonna have to catch it pretty damn on point. It's not gonna be too forgiving. So I would almost even make the case that handle play can be beneficial.
I prefer having some handle play for sure. Like I know that, and I have very minimal flipping experience, but I definitely, well, one, and this is just my own thing. I like the sound, like I like the clackiness of it, but I also do like having a little bit of handle play for I think the exact reason that you described. Although I don't know that I know enough about what's going on to say that that's why it is. But that to me seemed like the most plausible explanation. And just in terms of tap, just because I know there's, I'm sure there's going to be comments. Keep in mind, this isn't two flippers talking and saying that the tap argument and being outraged about it is ridiculous. It's somebody who's really good at flipping, and to be fair, then another person who's awful at flipping, but somebody who's good at machining stuff and understands tolerances and stuff, probably better than the average person complaining about tap, I would hope, right? So it's not like, if you're going to make an argument, make sure that it's well founded, right? That's my point, I guess, is it,
It's going to need to be based in some it could be anecdotal, but there needs to be some explanation as to how tap could seriously affect the performance of a balisong to where it would hinder flipping. And I just don't think there is an argument there. There is an argument 100% about, if there's blade rub, that's not going to look too good, or, I don't want it to smudge or whatever, snail trails. You can make that argument, but in terms of performance, I'm not seeing it. I've never felt like that was a critical factor.
Well, in fact, you actually have to have, technically speaking, on some level, play. And this is even something when it comes to screws. Like, essentially, if you're doing manual machining or something, the different, essentially where the screw, like the threads make contact, I believe it's called lands, where those lands are contacting, like there has to be some amount of play there, otherwise it would be seized up. And it's the same thing, like if you have no handle play, when you move the handles, you will be creating handle play because it needs handle play to move. So bearings make it essentially no handle play, but I believe, and somebody can correct me, on a technical level, there still needs to be some level of play, which is why ball screws like you would have in a CNC machine still have, mine has like about 1.2 thousandths of an inch play compared to, I don't know what it would be on a similar sized one with a lead screw, but probably like 30 thousandths or something, right? So,
I'm wondering if some of the hype around bearing balisongs comes from that whole tap argument. I'm starting to connect some dots in my head, and it's leading me down that path. That because you can get the play probably a little bit closer to non-existent, that someone will equate that with better quality, no tap, amazing,
What I
put the bearings
prefer,
in.
in my opinion, maybe again, this is from the perspective of someone who doesn't flip, but someone who tries to design stuff, and so I focus on how things are designed. I like what Squid did, where he added relief on the underside of the handles so that even if there is some handle play, you still don't have tap, which is kind of funny because it kind of obliterates the argument on some level. Like it throws like a wrench into the idea that to have no tap, you need to have bearings or whatever, right? Or like very nicely tuned bushings. You know, it's designing something in a way that just eliminates the problem is by far the best solution, in my opinion.
I agree, and I'd actually be curious to see more companies implement a similar design choice, because you kind of get the best of both worlds. You can have play, and the aesthetics of your battle song are probably going to hold up a bit better. You're not going to have to be as worried as, oh no, there's the smudge of it taking off the finish, that it's taken off my stone wash, it's taken off the bead blast. You'll probably retain a good finish on your knife, which is always an added bonus.
Which is what I did on my Spitfire design. Like I have relief on the underside there, and it's a lot of relief. Like to cause the blade to impact the underside of the handles, you need a truck or something. Like I'm exaggerating, but you really would need an incredible amount of force. Like that's a huge amount of displacement. So, you know,
I like it. I like it.
so that's that, I guess, with the tap and stuff. But how about weight?
Yeah, so this is the part that I had alluded to earlier.
Weight separate from balance point. We will talk about balance point, but weight aside from balance point.
There is what I call a Goldilocks zone. That zone, to me, is anywhere from 3 ounces in weight to, I'll go all the way up to 6 ounces. So 3 to 6 ounces is the Goldilocks zone. Well, what does that mean? Well, if you take a knife that is under 3 ounces, I'm going to wager that it's probably going to be too light. Even if every other part of the knife was perfect, it's probably not going to carry momentum how I want it to. On the other side, 6 ounces and above, you get into the territory of it might carry momentum too well, and you hear that and think, well, why would that be a bad thing?
Well,
Well,
now you have 9 fingers.
or it just, even if injuries aside, it's going to be a little bit harder to stop that knife. So if you want to say you want to do a ricochet, you want to do maybe some more twirling, scissors, and whatnot, things like that, it's going to take a little bit more force to get that knife to behave how you want it to, where that lighter knife is just going to do it pretty much at your will. So that is why I say 3 to 6 ounces is my Goldilocks zone. I think most people, if you took a kind of like a survey of what knives people like, I think you'll find that some of the top flippers are going to fall right in between 3 to 6 ounces and not deviate too much from that.
Yep. Now, and again, we will be sort of running through these topics again briefly from an EDC perspective. But I definitely think the answer changes somewhat when you look at it from the context of EDC. So we'll go into that
sure.
some. But yeah, I would agree that like what I've been told by and large by people, and believe me, I get lots of messages with people suggesting things, and I appreciate it, right? Because like I said, I don't flip, so a little bit like I would just be making stuff up if I didn't have feedback from people, right? So, but I'll have a lot of people message me saying, hey, you know, this is the best weight. And it's generally between 4.3 and 4.8 is what a lot of people really seem to like, in my experience, at least for the kind of knives that I'm working with.
And it makes sense because a lot of flippers are very, very close to that weight. The bare bones, I thought it was a little bit heavier too. I don't know if the first model was. I didn't actually check that, but it's actually 5.25 ounces. I thought it was closer to 6, but yeah, someone else commented that as well. So I think you really are looking at probably 4 to 5 being the really sweet spot, but I would open it to 3 to 6.
Right. I would agree.
I don't have too much more there. I stick to that zone. I wish I could say there was more variety there, but I mean, if you have like a 12-ounce barrel song, the problem is the risk to injury goes up so high that even if it was perfectly balanced, I wouldn't be interested in flipping it. I'd be more likely to have a serious injury, and at that point, I don't want to really use it for flipping.
Right. Now, how about balance point?
Balance point, at least from what I've heard and kind of how I feel, it breaks into two categories, either blade biased or handle biased. You can have neutral as well, so I guess there are three categories, but typically it's going to fall into one or the other category. I prefer handle bias. Why? Well, typically those knives are going to carry momentum a little bit better. So I like tricks that require a little bit more technical ability. So you're looking at, as an example, the reverse behind the 8 ball, or I'll try and do some tricks where I'll do a chaplain into an aerial that I'll catch. Those type of tricks, I feel like momentum benefits a lot more. If that wasn't the case, if I liked doing more twirls, more scissors, things of that nature, I feel like I would prefer, maybe not prefer, but I'd lean more towards a neutral, and I'd even go possibly to a blade biased balance point. But from my experience, I just prefer the handle bias. And again, that ties to the momentum issue. It's going to be a little bit easier to predict where that handle's going than if that balance point was at the blade.
Right, because it is easier to pivot in other directions the more it's, centralized.
Yeah.
One thing that I think is interesting is like the number of people who have mentioned to me like, oh, I like knives that are a little bit more neutral. It makes me question the definition of neutral, because a lot of people seem to like, if neutral is what is average, right? And I understand that you can make different definitions when it comes to the actual location on the handle or whatever, but technically all of them are handle biased, at least to some extent, right? And so like the handles aren't weightless.
Oh, exactly.
Is my point. But I it makes me wonder whether the idea of the average that people have in mind is more like handle heavy than people think or whatever. Like it seems like what the actual desired average is actually closer to the blade than what the perceived average is, just in my anecdotal experience.
Possibly. That's a possibility.
Yeah. So how about length?
Length, we have another Goldilocks zone. So I would say that zone is no shorter than 4 inches and no longer than 6 inches. I feel like once you start getting too short, you run into issues of real estate for your fingers to manipulate the knife. When you get too long, you run into the issue of just way too much. The handle could start hitting other fingers when you're doing tricks. It could hit your wrist depending on depending on the exact location of your wrist and your hand. But say you're doing a scissor, it might, if that handle's too long, it could come around and just stall on your wrist and you're just dead in the water with your combo. So I would say you're looking at 4 to 6 inches. I would probably narrow that down, and I just want to take a second look at some of the lengths of the battle songs I have. I'm gonna say, for my preference, I'd like to see closer to 5 to 5.5 inches in length.
Yeah, I will say 4 I think is shorter than people realize. Like that's less than what a 32 has for handle length. You know, like a stock 6X is 5 inches. You know, which a lot of people would say is short. The 51 is like 4.25, I think, or maybe, or I'm sorry, 5.25. Something like that, 5.125 maybe.
Yeah, a lot of them are very close to 5.5. And yes, kind of to that point about the 32. Yeah, you can manipulate a 32, but like that's like the bare bones. And I kind of include it. I include that shorter length because if you have little hands, like let's not disregard that there
like
could
the president.
be. His hands are very large, actually.
Yeah.
But suppose you are a female flipper. You might not have dude-sized hands. Chances are you probably don't. And maybe you do.
Dudette-sized hands.
Yeah, maybe you do. But chances are they're probably going to be a fair bit smaller. And given that, a 32, while it might not be flippable for a 6'2" guy with big hands, might be pretty flippable for like a 4'10" woman. So,
or like, you know, if you want to get your 6-year-old into flipping.
Which, yeah, I mean, yeah, I guess even if you want to take it to that level, yeah, a smaller battle song would be more adapted for even probably even a teenager, depending on the teenager and on their growth spurts and whatnot. But I feel like people don't consider that part, so I kind of don't like to hammer it just to the go straight to 5.5, just go straight there, because there is some variance in, well, gee, like, are we just going to exclude a potential market of flippers just to be like, nah, it's 5.5. Yeah, I don't care. That's the best.
I think 5.3 is
best.
best.
Oh.
That's just my, like, when I was first getting started and I was making stuff by hand, and it like, there's a question of like, how long should the handles be? I started, the first set that I ever made, like for somebody else for sale, was 5.5 inches, and there were some problems with that. So I ended up having to exchange it, but I decided to just make 5.4 inch handles after that because I wanted shorter handles for EDC purposes, and I thought it looked better, like proportionally. You know, having like a 5.3 inch handle on a knife that was designed with 5-inch handles as opposed to 5.6 inch handles on a knife with a blade that was designed for 5-inch handles. And I did have somebody that was pushing me to make them 5.6 and even longer. And it's like, at a certain level, you know, like I was listening to what people were saying, I thought people were saying, when I made the first set of my 6X handles, like the first, the ones that I made on the CNC machine started out at 5.4 inches. But eventually I was like, you know what? I just want 5.3 inches, so I'm just going to do 5.3 because I'm selfish. And what I found out is actually there was a huge number of people that preferred 5.3. So it was definitely a vocal minority that were complaining about them being shorter. You know, and I think it's similar to, there's a vocal minority of people that I still will never understand, other than just people who want to control stuff for no reason, like messaging me and like trying to tell me I shouldn't put latch holes on the Spitfire. Like it's like,
we're
like,
gonna get to there.
We're getting there.
Oh
my, okay. Yeah. The
Not
point
yet,
is, sorry. I'm traumatized. I'm telling you. But yeah, I guess I think 5.5 is getting on the long side, in my opinion.
I agree. No, I do agree with that. I think my Goldilocks zone is 5 to 5.5. Once you start getting into the 6, and I do have, I would say, at least average size hands. Once you start getting to like 6 inches, I mean, yes, they can be good, but they might start to fall into the category of better for some tricks than others. That's kind of where I'm starting to take that. Where too short will start to you're just not going to be able to do certain tricks, or it's going to be extremely difficult. Too long, you're probably still going to be able to do all the tricks that you want, but it's definitely going to be tailored for some tricks above others.
Not all tricks are created equal.
This is true. This is true. Like, well, just as an example, I imagine if I was to be doing a 0G chaplain, if my hand isn't, and my hand and wrist position isn't perfect, if it's kind of like bent, like a crane, if my hand's kind of in a crane position with my wrist, it's probably that handle might actually hit my wrist. Yes, if it's perfectly straight, it's just going to keep going straight under. But you start getting into the possibility of stalling your knife because you're hitting your own body. Like I know 6 is not quite excessively large. Like there's those big balisongs that are huge. I think Bradley, there might have been a Bradley version. I think it was called the Titan. And I know there's some super cheap ones out there that are like 13-inch. It might be 13-inch handles, or it might be 13-inch. Not 100% sure what the actual specifications are, but there are cheap ones that exist that are very long.
Hashtag supersize my CSGO knife.
Oh no. Did we put that on? I don't think we put that on the list. Curve versus straight.
Let's add it because that's definitely.
Such.
I'm gonna add that. I'm gonna add that after width. Okay. Actually, no. I'm gonna add it under the handle considerations one.
Yeah, I think. Well, actually, I guess that does tie in pretty well after width. So we can get to, and I think that would fall under handle considerations. We can touch on width because that is very important. And I don't think it's something that people think of immediately when it comes to picking out a balisong.
Right.
Because there are some balisongs I've flipped that have been straight up ruined because of decisions made about the width. An example, and it was a balisong that had so much potential, and it broke my heart. Combative Edge did a balisong that had potential. And then they slapped Tumor G10 scales on them. They were just straight up tumors. And it made the knife just such a displeasure to flip that it didn't matter that the weight was fine. It didn't matter that the length was fine. The width of the handles actually ruined that balisong as a flipper. Maybe not as an EDC. You could probably still use it as an EDC, but for a flipper, absolutely not. I don't know what the exact specifications fall into. And I might have at one point wrote it down, but I know I've fallen between, I'd say, a bare bones being the minimum thickness that I'd be looking for, and then going up to a what is the model? A Ham Basilisk R, and saying that's the maximum thickness I'd be looking for.
That's a thick. Yeah.
I like it though. I like that thickness.
I'm not complaining. It's not too thick. Okay.
And let me see if I can actually find the number while you give your take.
One thing that I will say is the bare bones, I will say, in my opinion, is too thin. But that's only in the context of just like, I guess, looking at it outside of the considerations for the design. Like, there's a reason it's thin, right? Their whole goal was to create, ideally, a cheaper knife for people that still flipped well. And if you're using steel, there's only so much you can do to get the weight down before you make it thinner. Trust me. Trust me. Okay. It's something you're constantly fighting against. And it's one of the things that I had to deal with the replicant handles that I made, because I didn't like that. Like, I didn't want to have to mill something out on the underside because I felt like it was cheating for some reason. But there was just no way. Like, my goal was to have the handles be as close to the original replicant handles as possible in terms of thickness. Now, there's really no effective way to do that out of titanium without having some kind of weird, but I sort of had to mill out the underside to make it so that I can have them be thicker and more comfortable, but that's even using titanium. That's not using stainless steel or whatever type of steel they use. So
I found some numbers. While you were discussing that. It seems like the Goldilocks zone is 0.4 inches to 0.6 inches. I looked up the competitive edge balisong. That one was a whopping 0.7 inches. And you hear 0.6, 0.7. I think if my math is correct, that's almost a 15% difference in width.
That is insane.
That is a lot.
Yeah.
So I think if I had to put it in a range, that would be 0.4. And again, it's not the only thing that's gonna matter. But if you look at a balisong and you see something wild like 0.8 inches, run. If you see something ridiculous like 0.2, which I don't even know if it'd be possible, but run.
Do not tempt me.
But run, do not walk away from that balisong if you're thinking about buying it for flipping. Run.
For anything, really, on a certain level. Like, there gets a point, like, I would say that in their own context, like, the acceptable range, is different for EDC and flipping. But I would say, like, there are definitely things you can do that make a balisong not fall into either of those by a substantial margin.
Oh, sure, yeah. It could be kind of a happy medium. And even there are some characteristics that from EDC versus flipping, it's probably not going to vary too widely in the effect that it has. Like whatever characteristic, it probably won't have a super big effect as, well, yeah, you could use that for flipping or EDC and it'd still be pretty good.
Just to answer the question that Nanners has, I'm using S35VN for blade steel.
And this actually walks right into blade considerations.
Including comfort. Now, just keep in mind, the comfort of the edge, it's not meant to be comfortable. You're supposed to not get cut, right? But aside from
better
that,
if it was comfortable, though.
Yeah.
Oh, it was just like a
there are some people who have some quite comfortable live blades, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But there are definitely, and we actually talked. It's interesting. Can I go on a little bit of a tangent?
Oh, sure, yeah.
It's still related. Because I was making handles up until the Spitfire, I kind of, when you work on something for a long time and you're always looking for improvements, right? You find all of these little tiny, details that you would otherwise not notice, right? And I was not expecting the number of things that could go wrong on the blade, right? And I mean, there was nothing like too serious, when you were reviewing it, even the first time, because I'm not completely insane. Well, I'm pretty insane, but I'm not completely incompetent, right? But there were quite a few things that you were pointing out, right? Like, you can have a choil. And a choil, just for anyone curious, is like the little kind of semicircular indent behind the blade. Frankly, every knife needs one, okay? Unless it's like a kitchen knife, which technically I suppose has a massive choil, right? But, you had said have it be kind of like the replicant, I believe you used as an example, in the sense that it doesn't just, the choil doesn't just like it comes back out again. I don't know. I really wish I had my whiteboard thing set up so I could draw it, but we'll do that. We'll discuss next time.
I think
but,
it was, yeah. I'm pretty sure that was the point made where it doesn't suddenly turn into a smaller blade. It's still a sizable blade.
Right, because if you don't do that, like you had said, like all of a sudden now you have like another tip on the knife, you know? So
Yep.
some
Yep.
edges are less comfortable than others, I guess, is the main thing. But just there's a lot to the blade design that I was surprised by, even after I'd spent a while thinking through it. So I think you probably have some interesting stuff to say on that.
Oh yeah, I think people take the even something as simple as the spine of the blade for granted when it comes to flipping. And you kind of hear that, and maybe if you're someone more experienced, you hear that and say, "Wow, really?" Well, yeah. I mean, think comfort alone. Do you want just a square spine to be digging into your skin when you're doing like chaplains or whatnot? Maybe. I mean, maybe if you're masochistic like that. But you can increase the comfort. You can have a chamfer, a nice little chamfer down the sides of that spine, or you could round it. But then you can end up in a situation where, okay, well, what do you prefer more? I flipped some rounded knives on the spine that I just did not like using for aerials, particularly like chaplain aerials. So what that would mean is you're doing a chaplain around one of your fingers. You try and release it so that you can go into a scissor, or you could just ice pick catch it or whatever. And I found that the aerial, it would kind of have a higher tendency of wobbling off of where I wanted it to. Whereas a more squared off spine, but still softened like a chamfer, had a much better trajectory where I would release it and it had a higher tendency to stay on the course that I released it on. And I think it has to do with that square contact um, touching your finger versus a rounded spine having the ability to kind of rotate around your finger. I don't like that as much. But that is just one factor on the blade to consider. And a spine cannot make or break, well, it can. Typically, it's not going to make or break a knife for flipping. And I kind of went to the maybe because you could have a double sided balisong, like a dagger style balisong, and it can still flip well. And a lot of people don't really consider that you can do a lot of tricks on a double edged balisong just fine. I mean, there's a little bit of a high risk increase, but you can still do a scissor. You can still do, believe it or not, a behind the eight ball. I have a tutorial on it. I'm gonna plug myself right there. You can do fanning. There's nothing stopping you from doing fanning. Really, the only trick you're cut off from doing is chaplains. That's the main trick that you cannot do. I've seen some people work around that to a degree where you kind of float your finger around the handle, but to me, it's just too sketchy to attempt it, and I'm not for something that most people aren't going to care about or notice. I just don't feel like trying it. But you can still flip a double-edged balisong well, and that is just one aspect of the blade to consider. This isn't even considering like tip shape. You have something like a Basilisk R versus like a 51. You have a different distribution of weight, but you also have a difference in if that blade hits your hand, the effect it's going to have. A Basilisk R is going to go straight into your hand. A 51, yeah, it'll still poke you, but it's probably not going to do nearly as much damage. And that's not really so much of a, well, how does it perform? But when I'm flipping it, I don't really like thinking about that Basilisk R tip going into my hand versus something like, or even an alt replicant is way less threatening than a Basilisk R. So in some ways, it does affect performance because it affects how you are thinking about the knife when you're flipping it. There's a lot more danger involved with a Basilisk R over something like a 51 or something with a fatter, or I'd say more paddle-like shape. Um,
Um, so just because I want people to laugh at my drawing, I'm just drawing something here really quickly to show sort of what I'm talking about. Now, I feel like that drawing needs a little bit of improvement.
See what we got
Oh,
here.
okay, I just deleted it. That works
Nope.
too.
Oh, perfect.
I'm really good at this, actually. I don't know. Oh, I still have the eraser out. This is why I'm not a teacher, just in case anyone's curious. Oh my God. Okay. I love intuitive stuff like this, by the way. All right. So I'm going to try to draw what we were talking about as far as the choil goes, okay? You're probably good to keep talking, but just so people know that's what I'm doing.
Okay, so you're still going to be drawing. Okay, so sure. There's other things that we can talk about with the blade shape as well. The choil versus non-choil aspect, if it's not implemented well, can have a negative impact on the flipping experience. So, and I think you touched on it pretty well, but just to elaborate on it, sometimes decisions are made that make it seem like they want to preserve symmetry and they want to preserve choil symmetry on a ballad song. The problem is you could run into a situation, and this is an example that immediately comes to mind. There's actually two examples that immediately come to mind. The EOS Serpent and then the Hom Chimera. They preserve symmetry at the cost of that choil on the spine not being comfortable. Your finger falls into it, or even if it doesn't really fall into it, you feel it when you're doing something like a chaplain. And if you're doing a lot of flipping, it gets uncomfortable. On the edge side, it doesn't matter too much because you're trying to avoid that choil. You don't really want to have your finger down there to begin with. But on the spine, a decision like that matters. So it's like, oh well, just having a rounded or chamfered spine's enough. No, that's not enough. You got to look at what's the cutout like. On a Tang pin knife, you're not really going to run into that issue, but on a Zen pin knife, that's typically a more common design decision.
So I'm going to try to draw like a little dashed line here, but essentially, do you have this, Zen pin cup? Does it continue tangentially, or does it go back out again? Because if you have it go back out again, then it's going to be difficult to fit your finger, too far into this. Whereas if it's not there, you can get quite a ways in here, and that point becomes an ouchie. So I guess it's like, does that make sense to people?
It's a little for me it's a little high level, but then again, you're not dealing with an Einstein over here. But I think what you're
You're
going
a
for
Tesla.
is Tesla.
To answer,
I have big dreams.
Nerds fan asks, wait, do pinless knives have choils or quires? But I assume he means choils. I don't know. They might have quires, but choils, it depends. Like, it depends how you design it, really. You can design it with or without a choil. And I would design it with one, that's for sure. But
speaking of that, actually the choil point, but also the pinless point, we completely forgot to talk about that in our discussion of flippability. And just to kind of put my 2 cents out there, the reason why we probably forgot about it is because I don't think it's a design decision I want in my ballad song. And there's also probably a reason why a lot of companies haven't done it frequently. Some people might think that this was a recent design developed. It's not. I think it might have been K-Bar that had a pinless ballad song design almost over 100 years ago. So it's not a new design if anyone's mistaken on that. And you can look it up as well if you'd like.
yeah, so I can definitely talk about that a bit. how do I put this? Actually, I'll put it the same way that I've put it when talking with you, which is there are people who claim to be the inventors of the pinless design, right? They didn't invent it. They're just the first person to not realize the problems with it, right? Like, I've wanted to do a pinless design for a very long time, but there were some very, big problems with that, especially if you're using especially if you use aluminum on the handles, right? I feel like that should be
Yeah.
self-explanatory if you're somebody that does any kind of design, right? But even titanium, right? Titanium is not a particularly hard metal. It's a lot harder than aluminum, but yeah, pinless. You can have you can have a pinless design that works, which is like the design that I'm using on my knife, but I designed it specifically, like understanding the problems that you would encounter from some of the other designs, right? So it's a little bit, yeah. I think it's probably something we can go into a lot more depth on when it comes to the quality discussion, but the only impact I think it has on flipping is, do the handles get stuck open? Because in some designs that could happen. Not stuck, but like sticky, like it takes extra
Yeah.
force to overcome it. But, as long as the handles aren't touching or impacting each other and then returning to a short distance away or something, I don't know that it has that much of an impact, but
No,
yeah,
in
so
terms of flippability, I have not flipped one, but I would expect the impact of that design choice to be minimal. And it would come back to more likely what other choices were made in the design, because I wouldn't be able to say 100% if a pinless battle song was going to be better than a Tang pin, because there are some examples of a pinless battle song that would actually be better than a Tang pin battle song. But you have to see what the other materials are, what other design choices were made before you could 100% say whether or not you would choose one over another for flipping.
right. And the reason why, so like the design that I came up with mine, and maybe at some point I'll show the design on stream or something, but as for right now, I don't really want to show any CAD stuff. But the reason why I did the design that I did is I wanted to have the smallest possible Zen pin nipple, right? There's nothing about the pinless design in mind that makes it better as far as like, I don't know, like structural soundness or something. Like it's just a question like of the secondary impacts of that design. Like I wasn't quite able to get the design that I wanted with what's out there, so I tried to come up with something else, and I ended up coming up with it, right? But it's not.
Yep.
It's a totally different thing to be going around saying like, "Oh wow, look, my pinless design is going to change the whole world of battle song flipping." Like that's just, it's delusional, honestly.
Yeah,
So
delusional would be the right word. And again, it kind of goes back to, and I probably didn't word it the best originally, but there's probably a reason why many companies veer away from it. It's probably because it does have a lot of challenges to make the design work. Now, the Monarch is one that I have seen, and I have been interested in it. Main barrier being price is quite high. I mean, rightfully so, but it's still quite high for me, for my budget. For someone else's budget, that could be chump change, and they could just pick up 10 of them. Um, but for me, it's kind of like, well, do I want to buy 3 knives or do I want to buy 1 knife? I don't know. That's kind of where that falls into. It's nothing nothing along the lines. It should be cheaper. It's just for my budget, it's an ouchie. Um,
a pinless design, you shouldn't, in my opinion, and I'm saying this as someone who's selling a pinless battle song, right? Like, you shouldn't pay an extra $100 or something for something like that. Like, it doesn't. this, you can pay extra money in the sense, like, if you like the secondary effects of it. But I just don't think it's honest to go around advertising a knife, like saying that the pinless design is going to change how people flip, because it won't.
Yeah, and I don't think, and just to clarify there, I don't think that JK Designs has done that, but
Oh,
I
I don't know.
think,
I was still thinking about the other
yeah,
person.
I think a different maker has made some claims along that line, and I would agree that on its own, no, Pinless ain't shaking up too much.
I will tell
It's
you.
a
Sorry, go on. Sorry, I thought you were ending.
no, no, I didn't have much more to add there.
You had shown me some of the stuff that JK Designs had done, and if I'm remembering correctly, and I think I am, there's when you have spent a while like designing CAD models and stuff, you can look at somebody's design and be like, oh, that person knows what they're doing in CAD, or this person knows just enough to sort of make a working ballast on. The stuff, and especially the blades that you had shown me that he did, like, it's very, very obvious that he puts a lot of thought into the design and stuff, and he knows how to do it, right? It's like,
Mhm.
and I believe one of the blades, the holes are not drilled in a straight line; they're drilled along a path, right? Which is
Yeah, it's a curve.
right. It takes extra work that people don't necessarily think about, but you need to when you're designing it. And so my guess is if he has a pinless design, it would not have the same problems that the other person's had.
Likely, likely.
Right. That's just my suspicion.
And it might tie back into why is the price so high? And that's part of it too, where, well, why aren't these companies doing it? Maybe there's just that additional skill that they don't want to have to deal with, that additional knowledge of machining, if I'm wording that correctly, that they just don't want to have to deal with. Maybe extra time on the machine that will decrease productivity.
Well, it doesn't do that. Like having, for example, something where you're drilling holes in a curve instead of a straight line, that could have an impact if you're doing it on a manual machine, because you can only really move one axis at a time on a manual machine. But and so it would take extra like pause and counting stuff. But as
Yeah.
far as CNC stuff goes, the biggest thing, it's not, in my opinion, a matter of it's certainly not the machining for the most part, because a lot of them are just getting them made in a machine shop, like they're not making them themselves.
Yeah.
And so then it becomes not a question of how difficult is it to make the tool path. It becomes a question of like, how difficult is it to make the CAD model? And I can tell you, if you look at the Alpha Beast, right, and you look at the chamfers on the side, those chamfers were, I mean, unless there's some other way that they did it, which was like really inefficient, which I doubt, those were done with essentially like a swept cut. And that's something like where you extrude a cut along a path. That is not something you find on just, some random person who, is just barely getting into it. And they're like, oh, well, it would be cool if I could sell knives. They like, you can tell a lot of times who those people are because of certain things that maybe I'll go into in the future, but I know I've told you. But anyway, the point is the design of someone's knife, you can tell a lot, like about how much thought they put into it.
Oh yeah, you definitely can. And oh yeah, but that could be talked about at length, but I don't think we need to here, but it is something to think about.
Right. Because it has a secondary impact, I guess. Like if you look, I guess the reason why I keep going back to it is the flippability of a knife. And this is separate from quality completely, okay? But the flippability of a knife will be impacted by the ability of the designer to come up with a design that's, for example, comfortable, right? And so if something is clearly designed well, it's more likely to flip well. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah. Oh, far more likely.
But yeah, so you had mentioned about the using curves on the top as opposed to chamfers, right?
Curves versus. I was just talking about rounded versus chamfer or flat, and that effect that it could have on the spine of the blade.
Yeah, and this is the conclusion that we had come to, I believe, unless maybe, hopefully I didn't misremember this, because, I just got a bunch of tools to do this. But, I do, so if you have a curved edge, like a small curve, like a round over, it's called a fillet, Fillet. And it's, similar to a chamfer. It's just curved instead of a straight, just like cutting off the edge kind of.
Yeah.
That, to me, the reason why I chose that for the Spitfire blade is because I wanted to have the flat, because like you said, having the flat there helps to, well, one, keep the knife oriented correctly, but also to know where it's oriented. But having the rounded over edge is more comfortable, right? So I don't know. I was a little bit trying to get the stupid drawing thing to work, so you might have gone
I
over
think
that.
Yeah, I think people can imagine that pretty effectively, where there are some examples of a rounding that can be described as a full-on like semicircle. Like if you're looking at it from that perspective, it's like a semicircle. I do not like that. If, however, you can basically combine the qualities of a chamfer and a rounding where you still retain a flat surface down the spine, but the edges of that are soft, that's great. It's just not something that I commonly see. It's usually one or the other. Either they go all the way round or they just do a chamfer. At least that's been my experience.
Yeah, I think, and maybe, oh shoot, I don't. Is the premium replicant, does it have a crown spine?
Depends on the model. Previous models on the alt had a flat spine. Standard models, as far as I know, have always had a crown spine or a rounded spine, and definitely new models, alt or standard, have a rounded spine.
Well, having the crown spine as opposed to, like you said, a full fillet, right, where it just completely rounds it into a semicircle. I think that is definitely, in my opinion, is better than a completely flat top. Just in my limited flipping experience, it's more
Those
comfortable.
yeah, a 90-degree angle, even if it's not a true 90-degree, you still
89,
no,
91.
not feeling it.
Yeah. But I again, that's almost a, and again, we kind of, we just sort of like had like a broad topic, just blade considerations. But comfort is definitely one of the main things, is like, in my opinion, BRS made a mistake on the early bare bones. They made a few mistakes, in my opinion.
Oh yeah, I think, and I think they would, and it's those things that you're about to go into are the very reason why I think the V2 was even released at all. Is
Zen
because
pin nipple, is that word?
Yep, the Zen pin nipple. Yep, and I think the spine was flat too, which are things that were changed in the V2.
Yeah, and I think that those were definitely good improvements to make, but that's something to watch out for, is where are sharp edges, and where are your fingers going to get pinched? Actually, we didn't mention pinching anywhere in this. So given handle considerations is the next topic, and we've talked a lot about handles, go ahead and, yeah.
That would be a perfect thing to talk about. Handle consideration is the next big thing. I do think that people focus on it perhaps too much in comparison to blade consideration.
Like me.
But handles are a big deal, and there's a reason why there's so much debate about it. So one simple consideration when talking about, say, sandwich style is, well, yes, you can have sandwich style, but are there any spacers? Any spacers? Because if you have no spacer versus, say, a titanium block at the end of it, that balisong's suddenly going to flip way differently. Or maybe not way differently, but you're going to notice that weight not being there versus it being there. That's just one part of the handle. You could have blocky, pencil-shaped, or I'm not even pencil. You could have blocky rectangle handles, just full-on rectangles with those 90-degree angles, super uncomfortable to flip. You could have that. Just as well, you could have a basically full-on tube like a straw. That could be the handle, and that's got a whole.
Isn't there a new trainer out that's like that? It's got two little like.
Oh yeah, I know the brand too, but I ain't throwing anyone's design under the bus. But yeah,
Right.
I would not have done that.
How about tapered versus untapered, which is a question someone asked. Without
handles,
going into controversy.
are we talking about handles or blade?
Handles. I think handles.
If it's handles, I prefer for them to go from thin at the tang to thick at the end. The reason being is because I would like to have, if it comes down to maybe like a weight distribution or even just control of the knife in general, I want more real estate at the end of the knife for me to manipulate it than I do towards the tang. I would like to have more grip. Like, let's say I'm doing it around the world. I'd like for me to have a better purchase on the handle. And the way I would do that is by having more material to grab onto. Versus when I'm up by the tang, typically I'm just not going to need as much handle to have as much control. Or not, reword that. I'm not going to need as much material to have as much control.
To have the same level of control.
Correct.
Yeah, I'm on the side of tapered, just like you are. It adds expense in some cases, depending on the design. But you know, yeah. And did you talk about pinching, like between handles and between the blade and the handle and stuff?
Oh well, no, we haven't. Oh, man, there's still more to go over with handle considerations. So just aside from how round is it, how blocky is it, you can also get into pinching. Um, I, from what I can tell, that most commonly occurs because of a Zen pin. It's not going to happen with Tang. It's very rarely, in my experience, going to happen with a Tang pin knife. More commonly, pinching is an issue with Zen pin designs, where the Zen pin nipple will pinch your skin when it's going into the handle. At least that's where I've been pinched most commonly, is it's going into the handle, a little bit of skin gets caught there, and then pinch between the handle and the Zen pin.
And pinches are so much worse than cuts, in my opinion.
Sometimes I would prefer to get cut. There are times that I've been pinched that I would have preferred to have gotten cut. So that's another design decision to consider. So what I mean by that specifically is, and that's kind of a bit of a blade preference, but really do look at the Zen pin. Does it look like it's comfortable? Look at the handles as well. Not just the outside of them. Look at the inside of where of those handles. Are those sharp edges? Because that's going to affect comfort. If those are sharp edges, that's not going to be a fun experience to be pinched there. It's just not. If they're softened, yeah, you might still get pinched, but it's not going to be as bad.
Yeah, the underside of the handles being sharp is problematic for sure, just on a comfort level.
Oh yeah. And these are just part. We haven't even gotten into cutouts in the handles. We haven't even gotten into finish, polish, brushed, bead blast, stonewash.
The bead blast has some interesting considerations too. Which, do you care if we go into that briefly?
Yeah, sure.
Just one of the things I do with my designs is I will like mill a pattern onto the handle, and you know, when you were doing some testing for me, I had sent you some replicant handles that had I think it was a ripple pattern, but maybe it was the, you know.
It was ripple, I think.
Okay. And you had mentioned to me that it was uncomfortable after a while because essentially when I put the satin finish on those handles, I'm going over them with a Scotch-Brite belt. And what that does is it essentially, well, it also hits down into the sort of gullet, but it gets rid of the sharp sort of point at the top of those ridges. And if you don't, and you put the bead blast on, it sort of got abrasive on your hands. And so that was interesting feedback. So then it's like, okay, well, I need to make sure that those get softened. I think I do offer them bead blasted with pattern, but that, you know, was something that was an unexpected consequence of just mainly changing the type of finish.
Yep, and these are factors that when you're looking at a knife, it's a little bit harder. I mean, there's some obvious ones, but something like that is a little bit harder to anticipate when you're picking out a knife as if that's going to be a good flipper. When you're looking at a knife, you haven't touched it yet. Is it going to be a good flipper? Those type of things are a little bit harder to measure as opposed to looking at it and seeing, oh well, geez, it has no spacers. It's rounded like a tube. It's a straight on tube. It has no spacers. That is a lot easier to say. That's probably not going to be the best flipper versus that finish effect on it. That's something that is a little bit more nuanced, and you probably need just a little bit more experience with finishes and patterns to get a better appreciation for how that might affect the flipping experience in terms of comfort.
Yeah, but actually that's actually an interesting topic that's definitely relevant for flipping. I would definitely say that the finish is much more relevant for flipping than for EDC. For sure.
Oh, yeah.
Um,
Unless well, aesthetically wise, there's some arguments you could make for EDC, but function wise, finish is important for flipping.
for sure. Like, you know, and I think that's one of those things that, in my opinion, the best flipping handles that you could get from what I make and what I have experience with is bead blast, just because it has better grip. But I don't think it looks as good, right? Especially with the pattern. Like, people don't realize how that is not a very pronounced pattern. Like, that's quite subdued, right? Like, you can attest to that, right? It's definitely not like knurling or something.
No, it's not gonna catch your eye quite as much, but I would say function wise, you're gonna get a lot of grip off of a bead blast that you wouldn't get off of something like a really, even in comparison, even compared to most stone washes, a bead blast is going to offer more grip. Now, it runs the risk of having too much grip if, say, um, you're doing like a ridiculous number of chaplains around that knife. Bead blast can actually get slightly discomfortable, but aside from that, I mean, at least when I'm manipulating the knife, I like to have a little bit better purchase on what I'm doing, and bead blast will offer that. Still, stonewash is acceptable, brushed is acceptable, but they are things to consider. Just when
Polished
you're
is would have less grip than brushed. I'm sorry, stone wash. Depending on the stone wash, it may have more or less grip than a satin finish, kind of like a Scotch-Brite belt finish.
well, and
Um,
what's even interesting about that is I've noticed that sometimes even ano changes the at least unless it's a psychological thing, but I swear I feel a difference between just a regular stone wash and a stone wash with ano. I don't know what
it
it
can
is.
have an impact. You know, it would be very minute, but you definitely could have an impact in that sense. You know, in my opinion, and it's just a matter of the way that the um I don't know, maybe I'd have to give it some thought, but you know, so I guess the answer is I'm not sure, but the oxidation layer that you form on the surface of the titanium is very thin, but it's still a layer, you know.
Yeah, and actually, I see Nanner made a point. So I'm not saying that polished or brushed or whatever cannot flip great and don't have grip, but when I'm flipping, I've noticed that when my hands start to get a little bit sweatier, that's when it becomes a little bit more difficult for me. Whereas with bead blast, even if I have sweaty hands or sweaty fingers, I don't really feel like I lose control of the knife, if that makes sense.
The bead blast, you were right that it can be too grippy. And the first media that I used for bead blasting made it too grippy to the point where I was like, this is not comfortable, so I didn't offer it. But
Yeah.
I don't even know what I changed, but something changed. And all of a sudden, when I was doing it again, it was like what I wanted, right? Like it was more comfortable, way less like abrasive. It was just like a normal bead blast. So I don't know what I was doing wrong. Obviously something. But there's definitely, you can have too grippy of a finish.
Well, and what's actually interesting about the bead blast is there's actually, if you even go all the way back to the 42, the kind of go-to legacy ballad song, I'm pretty sure they had bead blast versus just brushed finishes. And I really do wonder.
On the 42?
I'm pretty sure they had some bead blast finishes. Let me
There
actually
may
look. I
have
think
been like a few, but the stereotypical 51 is a brushed finish.
51.
I'm sorry, 4X. I
Like,
meant
whoa,
4X. I'm just an idiot,
whoa,
okay?
let me see that 51. Where are they keeping that one? I want that one.
It's in the basement with all the other ballets that are not been behaving.
Oh no. I can't find. I'm trying to remember like what it's called.
I like Taters asks, have you noticed with bead blasts your hands feeling chalky? That's a problem I've noticed for some reason. I go ahead and give your insight. I have a theory though.
I mean, to a degree. At the same time, I don't really mind it. Like, yeah, this I like the super smooth feel of like that modded Alpha Beast I have. I like that super smooth feel. But I still kind of prefer the bead blast. If I had to say what do I feel like I have more control of, I'd say I feel like I have more control of the bead blast. That's kind of what that comes down to.
The 4X was primarily brushed. I'm just
Well,
responding to
see,
someone in
that's what
chat.
I was thinking of. The orange peel. That's the thing I recognize, and I don't remember what the process
Well,
for an orange
orange peel
peel.
is a very specific thing. Like it's like there's an orange peel finish. Like you can't. It's an orange peel finish is definitely distinct from a brushed finish. Although you use a wire brush in many cases to create the orange peeling. I'm defeating my own argument on a technicality. Okay, so but what normal people would call a brushed finish is definitely not an orange peel.
But I would imagine that that texture would be different. And again, I haven't touched a 42, but I imagine that texture would be different from kind of the brushed, just like how I'm imagining a brushed finish. I imagine the orange peel would probably feel probably a little bit closer to a bead blast. Maybe I'm making a bit of a wild accusation there, but if I had to imagine what it would feel like.
Um, I think it really depends on how it's done. Um, it's like you can have a brushed finish that has more grip than a bead blast, right? Um, but you can also have a brush finish that's like practically a polished finish. And so I think it has to do with like I think that the smoothness of a finish is separate and distinct from the type of finish. So I think the answer is it depends.
Oh, yeah, there's variance within that type of finish.
Yeah.
That makes sense. That makes sense.
Now, as for the chalky hands, the only thing I can think of is if your hands are getting calloused or whatever, and the bead blast is acting as almost slightly abrasive, I could see that somehow creating that kind of an effect, right? If you think of like your hands, if you've been like carrying stuff all day, that's the only theory I have for your question. But yeah, how about curved versus straight handles? Not to discriminate against non-straight handles. You
Yeah,
know,
we are a straight and curved handle safe.
and non-binary handle.
Yes, single handle, linear and binary. Or wait, is binary this? Let's not go too far down that road. Let's not go too far.
I prefer hex.
Oh, okay. Curved handles for flipping. You can do it.
Well, I can't.
I've seen people do it. I've done it on the Zabo fly, the Spyderco Zabo fly. You can do it. I just do not enjoy it.
And it's probably not good to learn on something that's unlike every other balisong you'd flip.
I don't know about that.
You don't think so?
I mean, the skills are transferable. It's not like you're suddenly not going to be able to do a behind the eight ball just because you learned on a curved handle balisong. I mean, it would be preferable if you learned on a straight handle, but it's not as if you're suddenly going to be needing to relearn everything over again. But with that said, typically the downfall of these curved handled balisongs is the weight distribution just it doesn't do well. You're going to have weird spots, and even for doing tricks, your fingers are going to fit in between the handles a little bit differently than the other. You're not going to have that symmetry that's going to allow you to do the same maneuver on a bite handle as you would on a you'd almost have to learn the characteristics of that curved handle to do the trick that you wanted.
Well, the reason for that, I think, is if you think of just the handle separate from the knife, like if you disassemble the knife, right, and you are holding a curved handle, the center of gravity for that handle is nowhere on the physical handle. It's off to the side, right? I mean, if you think of a curved line, right? Like, yes, I'm gonna have people yelling at me that if it's not curved enough, then you could still have it be on the physical thing, but it's on the CS:GO knife going to be out, off to the side of the knife. And so that's going to have an impact in a lot of ways on how that is going to handle just on like a physics level. And I have no idea when it comes to flipping, but on a physics level, like that's definitely a problem.
No, I mean, one problem on the Zabo fly I had is not only were the curves you're pretty exaggerated on that, you also had the issue of the weight of the handles varying by a lot. So not only was there that balance point issue that you're talking about, but just even weight of the handles alone you're learning two handles as opposed to learning one symmetrical handle.
Right. But also, if you look at, so like take an alpha beast and draw a line down the center of the blade from, I know this would vary on the blade shape, but like just draw it from the tip of the alpha beast blade to the center of the Tang, right? That is going to be roughly collinear with a line drawn from right in between the pivots and then right in between the bottom of the two handles when it's open or closed, right? That is wildly different on a knife that's curved, especially like the CS:GO knife, because if you look at it, one pivot is like higher than the other. If you're looking at it in a lengthwise thing, right?
Yeah.
That's definitely a questionable thing. I mean, I understand like aesthetically, but as far as how it's going to handle, that definitely is not normal.
Yeah, I would agree. You could make the case. You could make the case for an EDC having curved handles could actually be great, but for flipping, I'm not. I haven't seen, and it's proof. It's proof that they're not that good. I'm wording it really badly, but
No, you're spot on.
when you see competitions, whether it be a Blade Show or it just be an online two people posting a video battling each other or whatever, you don't see curved handled ballast songs used really at all. Maybe someone would use it. A scenario in which I would use it is if I just wanted to like shit on somebody, but I would have to know that the skill difference was vastly different for me to just make that decision.
Right. If I was battling you and I had my Alpha Beast, you would wreck me with a 53.
I don't know how the 53 that I don't know. I'd have to see. I think I think there's a video or two of was that the Mayhem? Or no, that's not the Mayhem. That's the
What mayhem?
that's a bench. No, that's the 53 is a bench made one.
Yeah. Here,
Yeah.
I'll show it on stream.
So I'm confusing it with the Bradley Mayhem because I think they were made around the same time.
All right. There. Now, I would still contend that the handle curve is not the problem so much as the pivots not being aligned. And I mean, this was clearly a stylistic choice, right? Like, it's not like they were just like, oh, we forgot how to make a ballast song. Like, this was intentional. So it's not like this is like a problem. It's just for flipping that would be potentially problematic.
Oh, that's why I'm confused. Yeah, the Mayhem. The Mayhem was made by Benchmade. That would explain a lot. No wonder I'm confused.
But yeah, so, you know, yeah.
I don't think there's.
Go on.
Wait, what's that? What is this? What we have this can shred on? Oh no, no, absolutely not. I feel like people. The whole appeal around the curved handle battle song is they look. I don't even think they look well. Okay, for me, the Zabo Fly looks incredible. The CS:GO style battle song, hard no. And then just for flipping in general, hard no. You're going to be dealing with having to learn two handles. There might be weight differences, as you had pointed out. There might be differences in like the actual height of the handle in relation to the other. It's not, to me, it's not worth having to go through all that effort just to flex by flipping a curved handle battle song.
One thing I want to point out, okay, just for anybody out there who's got a CSGO Bally, because I've had one in the past. I mean, like in CSGO. If you even look at the CSGO battle song in CSGO, the handles are already touching. So it's not even well made in CSGO. Okay, the Tang pins are already smushed. Or you just have a very, very strong hand, you know, with your cool new gloves that, you know, so Valve gets some more money.
Oh no.
But yeah, so that I would definitely say for anybody that's looking to, and again, I know that you're not as strongly opinioned on it as far as like, completely against curved handles, but in my opinion, it's probably much better to get, even if it's the same cost knife and it's the same quality level, it's still probably better to get a straight handled one, because I feel intuitively that would transfer more easily to, other knives that you would want to flip in the future.
That's the other thing too. There's not a big market for curved handled battle songs. So on top of just being easier to flip, when I say easier to flip, on top of straight handled battle songs being easier to flip, you're going to have more options if you want to get another battle song as opposed to curved handled.
Right. Now, this is definitely the most questionable one, which is the next topic. Latch pros and cons.
Ooh, if there's a topic that's actually going to anger people, it's going to be Latch pros and cons.
If you want to piss people off, let's just talk about pros.
Pros, okay. Pros of having a Latch.
There are no cons.
Absolutely zero cons. The main pro that I have for a latch, flip and only considering flipping, is that it's an indication on where you are on the knife. So if you're doing aerials, if you're doing bunch of twirls, whatever, you're almost always going to know where you are on the knife because you'll see that latch dangling around.
Or feel
It,
it.
or you might even feel it too. But it's going to be a visual indicator on where you are. Yes, you can look at where the blade is, but it's a little bit easier to see the dangly bit as opposed to looking for the edge on your knife.
I flip until I see red, and then I know I'm on the bite handle.
And I know some people circumvent this by using maybe tape. They wrap a little bit of tape around the handle or an O-ring or
Band-Aid. Something like that. I used a
yeah,
Band-Aid for a while.
really any other indicator that isn't the latch. But to me, I'm just like, well, it's an indicator and I close the knife with it and I open and I can have a closed, it's locked up. Why would I take it off? And even actually, Tater's made a good point here in the chat. You can actually use it for tricks. Not a ton of tricks, but the latch drop is one trick you can use it for. So you can actually even get some tricks out of the latch. Now, there are some arguments to be made for a latchless knife.
I cannot tolerate this disagreement. I need to mute you. I'm sorry.
Am I unmuted yet? Hello? Hello?
I'm joking. Oh my god. But yeah. Go on.
I think that crowd falls into they want like full on symmetry on that knife. And it might be aesthetics too. Like I know if you look at it, it's a little bit more aesthetically pleasing to have no latch hole there. I get that. But you're talking aesthetics at that point. You're not talking actual function.
Right.
Maybe the symmetry you can make an argument for there. Like if you take the latch off, it's gonna have more symmetry. But I almost feel like unless the latch is, and I think people made a complaint about the 80s, the BM87 latch, that one was heavy and actually noticeably heavy. But I think most other latches aren't going to be heavy enough to notice a big difference on when you're flipping it around.
Well, there is an argument to be made as well. Like I know Brandon Jones had said that he doesn't like latches because like they get in the way, like especially on maybe like an Alpha Beast where it can go off to the side and it's like a chunky latch. So if it gets pushed, it might not rotate smoothly back out of that position. If that makes sense.
So you mean it could actually interfere with the tricks themselves?
Right, if it gets in the way.
Yeah, it can. It can. It depends on the latch shape. That's for sure. I know BRS and I think some others have done a pretty good job of minimizing the chance of it actually getting pinned in between the handles.
The latch gate combined with the little what's the term for one of those triangles that has like the curve on it? There's like a term for that I used to know. I used to sound smart, but
I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah.
What I do know is a latch gate also helps minimize the chance of, well, that's actually especially important. A battle
blade
song
chipping.
Today, yes, a battle song today, 100, especially a quality one, 100% should have a latch gate. If it does not, no, I'm not flipping it. No. But
right.
I mean, maybe that was a factor to consider, like, I don't know, however many 20 years ago when there weren't really that many options and there were still battle songs being made without a latch gate. Sure. But I don't know. You have so many options with latch gates nowadays where it's a weak argument.
Yeah. Yeah, and I will say to some extent there are people who have contacted me and wanted me to make slabs for the 51 instead of scales. But the problem with that is it gets rid of the latch functionality, and then if you do still put the latch on, it definitely has no latch gate. Like, that thing goes way up. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's kind of like you can't go in between in some of these cases. Like, it's either you need to have the latch and be cool with it, or have no latch, because not having a latch gate is going to just wreck your edge.
Oh yeah, it happened on my Baron Sun 114. Latch would constantly come in contact with the blade, and not that I was really using it for much, but still, it's like it's not a good look when you're watching your blade get dulled by the latch. It's just not.
Well, it's not just dulled, and we'll cover this when we talk about the actual geometry and sharpening and stuff. And I'll even bring on some microscope pictures if people want. But I can tell you, if you don't have a latch gate and it closes on it, it will damage the edge. I don't just mean dull, like, it will damage the edge. You know, even if it's like, let's say you've just got this like perfectly round latch, like contact point or whatever, it's still going to roll over the edge on the, you know, in a decent area, right? So you need a latch gate.
Absolutely. Yeah, I definitely agree there.
But yeah,
I don't think there's too much. I know there's controversy around the latch, but I don't really think there's too much more to be said. I don't think the benefits you get from removing it are worth removing a latch entirely. So I think the best of both worlds is to have the option to keep a latch on there. If you want to take it off, fine, take it off. But I don't think it's worth removing the latch entirely for what little benefit you're getting from removing it.
well, one thing, so, and just because I know there's a delay here, Nanner, can you clarify which specific handles are you talking about? But to talk about the latch a little bit, one thing that I will say, and it is part of why, and maybe this is just me being me, right? It's like, if somebody is going to get upset and use their being upset to try to shut me down or something, I'm just going to do something to piss them off. Like, you know what I mean? And so to some extent, I feel like you encounter that with people who are very anti-latch. Not everybody who doesn't like latches, but there are a group of people. There is a group of people who is anti-latch, who goes around bullying, harassing, like insulting anybody who uses a latch, to the point where when I announced that I was going to be making a knife, within 30 minutes, I had like 2 or 3 people like messaging me saying that I shouldn't put a latch on it. And I had already announced there was going to be a latch on it. And it's like, it's just about control. Because I even said in the post that I was designing it such that if you remove the latch, and it is going to be a spring latch, which I understand that makes people concerned, but it's designed in a way that if you remove it, the handles are virtually identical in weight. Like, the only difference would be some sort of minor microscopic material imbalance, which might even make the, you know, the safe handle lighter or whatever without the spring stuff in, because they're all identical. The 4 slabs on that are identical as far as weight goes. So I don't understand what that is with people, but I definitely think there is a problem with people like that in the community going around and harassing other people just to feel, I don't know, cooler or something.
It is definitely strange. And actually, just one topic that I think and I kind of want to jump back to, because it's something very minute to consider, but I did want to touch on it. The wings on a butterfly knife, very
Like the
overall,
horns?
yeah, wings
Okay.
or horns. It's a very small thing to consider, but it does tie into that blade comparison thing, and I know we forgot about it. But overall, I'd say very minimal effect on the flipping, as long as they're not extremely pronounced. I think a good example of it being pronounced is probably the Hom. He probably has some of the most pronounced horns or wings. Um, and I don't really notice them for flipping. An Alpha Beast, certainly you're not going to notice that at all. And in some ways that can be preferable, but I would say for flipping, just to complete the discussion about the blade, the wings or horns, unless they're extremely pronounced, probably aren't going to affect the flipping that much.
I would agree. To answer Nanner's question, I know that and I've only ever seen this from people on Reddit or people who are on Reddit and also on Instagram for whatever reason. They're the only people that go around doing this kind of thing. They're probably the same people who complain about latches, but they have complained that my handles for the replicant are too thin, which is laughable because unless there's somebody out there that I don't know of, my replicant handles are thicker than any of the other ones because I do the milling, right? So I think that the people complaining about them being too thin they're doing it because they don't like me. They're not doing it as an actual criticism because it's just objectively inaccurate. Like I didn't like having them be thinner, which is why I do the underside milling. And actually to demonstrate my point, I had somebody, when I was, responding to some of these people, I'd said, well, what would you suggest? They said, well, you should do some milling on the underside to, reduce weight so that you can make them thicker. So it's like they clearly don't know anything about my handles. And I'm not just saying, like, this isn't some cliche, like, oh, I don't care about the haters, man. It's like, I mean, it's just a matter of, like, there's nothing, like, their complaints are 100% unfounded because they're not based on reality. It would be like, I don't know, saying, I really wish that BRS would make a Tonto blade for the replicant. That would make it a better knife. It's just ridiculous.
That on its own, that on its own,
it tells you all you need to know.
And maybe it might, but you're starting to get into fine tuning to a preference. Like you're fine tuning to a preference at that point. It's kind of like where I was talking about the Goldilocks zone type of thing. You can have a Goldilocks zone and you can make a lot of things work within that range. But when you start getting to pinning it down to saying, well, it should only be that weight, should only be that length, should only be that blade shape, then...
Well, my point was more so, and just for the people in chat, like, I'm aware that you guys were not, like, hating on my handles or anything. It was just... like the analogy I was trying to make is like, I don't know, how would okay. It would be like me saying, I really don't like the 4X series because they really should have put titanium handles on it. It's like, what do you mean? They have titanium handles. That's kind of what it is, right? So, I understand that people want them to be as thick as possible, and they are thinner than the stock ones, but there are just limitations as far as the weight goes, right? So,
yeah,
and one other thing, this is a little bit off topic, so I apologize, but a lot of people ask me, are the handles on XYZ thing going to ring like your replicant handles? And I don't know, because I don't know what I did to make the replicant handles ring. I care a lot about tolerances, and I know, my 6X handles will do that too. So it might just be the tolerances, but I don't actually know what causes whatever, sound people like. I wish I would, and I'm hoping it'll all sound that way for all the future ones, but I don't know, maybe something changes or whatever, and I wasn't aware of it, but I think they all kind of sound like they have that ring, so I assume they will continue to sound that way even with different designs.
Yeah, I gotta be honest, I don't know what caused it either, because I know sometimes I'll see sales posts and people will be like, "Oh, like it was something I saw with a Squid Bell song a while ago where this one rings and this one doesn't." It's like, what?
Well, you have to have, essentially, you need to get the handle vibrating at a high frequency, right? So, you know, there are all sorts of different things that can affect that. Even it's like, well, how tightly do the Zen pins fit in, right? Like how much clearance is there? Like that probably has an impact, right? How about sharpness though for flipping? I know that was kind of an abrupt change back to the thing, but how would you?
So kind of the last big talking point I would say for flipping. I think flipping sharpness is a must. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't have a trainer or you can't, like, say, tape up the blade to practice something that's dangerous. But for flipping, I just think to preserve what you're trying to do, like it's not like a freaking yo-yo, and you can do some cool tricks with the yo-yo. I'm not hating on anyone that does that. But to the art form of what you're doing, I would say flipping sharp is a must. Now, you can get into some actual, like, interesting conversations about, well, uh, how would I word this? Sometimes a semi-dull balisong can be more dangerous than a fully sharp balisong, and that actually can affect flipping. Where if you whack yourself, if it's got like a very jagged edge, you can end up with a cut that is going to heal slower than if you had just whacked yourself with a sharper blade.
I think it's a bell curve. Like,
Yeah.
I would definitely say, you like people. There are a lot of people who don't understand what sharp really is, and so it's important to put it in context in the sense that, like, if it's sharp, even if it shaves or whatever, like that's plenty fine. If you have it as sharp as a razor, you start getting into the territory of like you could do like nerve damage or something. Like
Oh yeah, they're definitely too sharp. Like, yeah, if it's
there's too sharp and too dull.
yeah, and I think it's reflected in a lot of cases, at least from what I've seen. You don't have like what's the geometry? A hollow curve.
You generally would not have a hollow on any on the bevel at the bottom. You might have a hollow grind on the grind of the knife itself, but most people will have either a convex edge or just like a flat.
Yeah, and I think it reflects that you can have a sharp knife, but you're not looking to have. I mean, there's a reason why you don't have. Like, I have one that has a literal razor blade that you put into it, and you can flip it. That automatic balisong. It's a literal razor blade. I'm scared. I'm very scared of that thing because it is sharper than any other balisong that I have and would cause way more damage than any other balisong. But given that, I also treat it with a lot more respect, and I don't do crazy tricks with it that I shouldn't be trying on it. And I don't fool myself into thinking that I can do any kind of crazy tricks on it without risking a lot. Whereas with let's say I was dull in a balisong, yeah, sure, just yeet, and then catch it however I feel like. Because, hey, the chances of me getting injured are, injured badly are a bit lower. Like, yeah, I might get hurt, but maybe not.
Someone had asked how sharp is what the Goldilocks is. I would say like
It should cut paper.
it absolutely should cut paper. Although keep in mind, the thinner the paper is, the sharper the knife has to be to cut it without tearing it. Okay. So that's a common misconception. People are like, oh, well,
like computer paper.
No, I understand. Well, what I was saying is between cutting standard printer paper and cutting phone book paper without tearing is probably plenty sharp enough. you know, for your average flipper to be flipping a knife that they can call sharp. And somebody had said, well, you know, I flip fairly dull, not gonna lie. That's fine. Like, that's not really, it's one thing. Like, the problem is with people who claim to be flipping a razor blade when they're flipping a trainer.
Oh yeah.
It's the dishonesty and the misrepresentation. That is a big problem in the community. But that's kind of separate from what makes a knife good for flipping.
Well, you might. Well, yeah, it kind of does. Well, but then again, yes and no. A sharp blade is going to force someone to have their technique be correct. If their technique is incorrect, they will find out very quickly that it is. So, in some ways, for flipping performance, you're probably going to develop better skills over the long run if you flip a live blade, and not just a live blade, but like an actually sharp live blade, versus flipping a dull or trainer. If you are very regiment about how you do tricks, yes, you can do tricks on a trainer just as well as you can on a live sharp blade. However, it's going to take discipline, and it might even become a psychological issue where if you then go from that trainer or dull blade to a live sharp blade, you might psychologically not perform as well.
Right. One other thing that is sort of related, but I do think needs to be addressed. There are cases where people will be like, oh, that person is flipping dull just because the blade touched their hand and didn't cut them. But the reality is, if you know anything about sharpening, I can take, and believe me, I've spent a while sharpening, okay? If I could go take one of my knives and sit there and touch the blade up to my hand, even with more force than you would think, and it wouldn't cut it, right? So it's about whether or not that handle is coming around and smacking into it, or if you're having a slicing cut. Because if you're slicing, like, yeah, it does not take hardly any force to cut.
Well, yeah, you either need pressure or a slicing motion. And I actually discussed this in one of my tutorials, the Zen behind the 8-ball tutorial, where if the knife has a falling motion on your hand, like imagine you're holding a kitchen knife and you're just putting your other hand out and you just lightly tap the edge on your hand. Are you going to get cut? Probably not. Similar to what you said, if you just touch the edge, are you going to get cut? Yeah, probably not. Same thing when doing balisong tricks, and you can slow it down, and I do slow it down so people can see it. If it's falling around your finger or falling onto your finger, it cannot physically cut you. It cannot. Now, if it ends up falling on your finger and all of a sudden you do a chaplain, well, rip-a-rooney, nice to know your thumb or your pointer finger or your middle finger.
It was great when you had it.
Yep. Great run. We made it that far.
Right.
But that's something some people don't understand, is the physics allow you to actually do quite a bit. And it's the same reason why earlier I talked about double edge flipping, because you can do a lot of double edge flipping, and people, I feel like, don't consider that. And so you don't really, I mean, you don't see a lot of double edge balisongs to begin with. They're kind of a niche, but it's possible to do a lot. It's really possible to do a lot. And
I've created some flipping video, like I've edited some flipping videos for Brandon where he was flipping his Talisong, and those were always cool.
Oh yeah, that's a super cool knife.
Yeah. Well, one other thing, similar to it's like the same deal with like this culture of people going around acting like they know everything. I had created an edit for him, and at one point it was bad timing, but the slow motion synced up with when the blade lightly touched his finger. It was light, right? Like, definitely not cut yourself force. And I was arguing with this guy in the comments on some iFunny post because he was saying like, oh, you know, clearly it's a dull knife. And I was saying like, it's definitely not dull. And this went back and forth. And he was like, I mean, I think I would know. I have the same knife. It's like well, that's a smart argument, right? Like, yeah, I have an alpha beast, so his must be dull. Like, what? And then the culmination of this is he was like, well, maybe you should look at the video more closely. And it's like, I made the video. What do you mean look at the video more closely? I created it, right?
Well, I will say you have to examine the video pretty damn well. If you're accusing someone of flipping dull, you got to be pretty damn sure that it is, because I mean, some of the people in the chat might know my reputation in some of the groups out there.
Cyberbully.
No,
I'm just poking fun. I'm just poking fun.
it's more like, don't sell false goods in this establishment, because a lot of times, and I know I'm guilty of it too. You just watch a video, and sometimes you don't want to have to think about if it's real or not. Like if it's actually on a trainer, like, well, I say trainer, but if it's on a dull bell song, or if it's actually sharp, you want to be able to watch it and just assume that it is actually sharp. Um, but at the same time, every now and then you see something ridiculous that looks ridiculously hard and ridiculously risky, and you rewatch it and you want to see how they did it. And
And it's
then,
sloppy or something.
yeah, and then you see that's kind of sloppy, and then you slow it down and you see that the finger placement's a little bit off, and you slow it down and you see that, wow, it kind of looks like that blade slammed into their finger, and they're not stopping at all. Like, a lot of times if I hit my finger, I'm just going to stop flip. I'm not going to keep plowing through the combo like it was nothing.
Because it's
Even,
already going wrong.
yeah, why am I going to keep going? And they just keep going, and then they finish out the combo, and you're like, wow, that's
It's a
huh.
lot of confidence.
Yeah, but it kind of makes you mad, because, like, what the hell? Why are you false claiming? What are you doing? Go to a different group that, like, you're trying to impress a bunch of people that can tell whether or not you're being legit. It's not like you're just doing it in front of a group of your friends who are like, "Ooh, that's cool." It's like, no, these people actually can notice, and they might say something about it.
Well, it's like this is a little bit of a tangent, but it's the same deal. I'd seen in this YouTube comment thread, this guy was arguing that, well, he's a pilot and has been for 40 years, and whenever he takes off, he never has his hand on the throttle or whatever. And nobody he knows does that. And it's like literally everybody else was like, I mean, me and everybody I know was trained to keep your hand on the throttle so that, well, you can make changes, but also so it doesn't, if there's friction or whatever, if the friction is not enough, then the throttle can back out from the vibrations. And it's like, this guy's literally on YouTube, probably pretending to be whatever age he even was, trying to convince a bunch of pilots that he's a pilot by basically saying to all of them, no, you don't know what you're talking about. And every other pilot I know says this thing that no pilot has ever said. Right? Like,
And this
it's the
this
wrong
actually
argument it's the wrong group to make that argument to.
And I think a good way to tie this into ballad songs is, unfortunately, you have individuals within the community that end up kind of being self-proclaimed experts. And the tragic thing about it is they start making claims about how a ballad song should be, and all of a sudden it kind of becomes the common thought because there's no other media out there challenging it. So this whole discussion is largely in part because, while people who know about flipping could probably talk at some of the points we talked about at way greater length, this could be a longer discussion on just the flipping aspects alone.
We're not even
Uh,
done with flipping, We still have
exactly,
EDC to do.
exactly. Um, but you get these people who just start making claims, and it's put out there. There's no one challenging it, and then you run into this problem where someone, and it actually kind of can hurt someone's feelings too, where they're getting this information off of like maybe YouTube or something, and then they go to like maybe a more dedicated flipping group, and then they get eviscerated by people saying, "Oh, what are you talking about? Like, no, the CS:GO Bally is not a good flipper. Like, no, why are you even asking? This is common knowledge, is it not?" Well, it's not. It's common knowledge in the group. It's not common knowledge to the person who's maybe new to the hobby, and they watch a YouTube video and then they take that as the gospel truth.
Well, but you also have, okay, you're a lot more likely to have a child who gets a CSGO knife because they like CSGO and they're like, wow, this is cool. It's like you generally wouldn't find like a 40-year-old that would start out with a CSGO knife just because like the source of their interest is completely different, right? But to have then this hive mind that's basically telling everybody like, oh, you're an idiot if you don't know this, then either one, they're going to be like, okay, F this community, right? Or they'll be like, they'll be insecure, they'll be hurt or whatever, and they'll want to fit in. And you're just creating further problems in the future because they'll do it to somebody else so that they can feel like they're part of the group, right? So definitely and did we talk about the history of this in the sense that like, there were a lot of times where we talked for quite a while. We both held opinions. Like we both thought some of these things that were supposedly common knowledge were absolutely ridiculous. And we're like, well, some other people might find these conversations interesting.
And I think, yeah, that is largely the part why we even bothered to do these streams, is because to what many flippers may consider to be common knowledge may not be for other people. And if there's only one source of information out there and it's biased a certain way, it's going to be very hard for them to consider other opinions when they're presented. When they go into these other groups, it's going to be like a whole different world, and it might be a hostile world too.
Right. So there's definitely like, I can tell you right now, like we would like the podcast to be, I don't know, appealing to most people, like not like to not upset a bunch of people needlessly. But this podcast is also definitely not going to be like pushing, like towing the line. Like we're going to be talking about some stuff and saying stuff that there will be people who don't like it. And frankly, that's unfortunate, but it sort of sounds like a them problem,
It's with anything though. I mean, if the information that we're putting out there isn't what someone wants to pick up, I can't force them to like it. It's not really my job to force them to like it. So, but that's with everything.
You just do your best. Like the goal is to help people, right? Like it's not like our goal is to like disparage a bunch of people, because I mean there are more effective ways to do that.
And there's plenty already disparaging commentary out.
Right, and it's not even helpful because they'll just say something, they'll just say something is dumb or whatever. This is a little bit related, but I had somebody message me and they were asking sort of for a quote on something that is generally very expensive, and because of the material, right? It was like Mokutai, Timascus type of thing, and they were frustrated because everybody had given them a really high quote, and because I would have had to give them a similarly high quote, it's like there's no use to me. Like I'm just going to frustrate them further. So I instead explained why it was expensive, which is if you mess up, the customer isn't buying you more material. You're paying it out of pocket, and it is not cheap. And so it's like there's a high risk to doing it, which is why it costs so much, right? And they were like, oh, like they were very appreciative, that I had explained it. And so I think that's kind of in a way what we want to do, which is like, even if we're saying something that other people are saying, which is that the CSGO knives are not great for flipping, we're not just calling people idiots for buying them. The goal is to educate or like help people.
Exactly. And if at that point, if after it's been put out there, it's kind of like one of those things where if the information's out there and people choose not to look at it, there's really not much else you can do. And realistically, I mean, not even just uh talking in terms of how would I word this properly? It can help them save a lot of headache in progressing in the hobby, where you can and there's a lot of people who have started the hobby and have come and gone and come and gone. There were some names mentioned in the chat. They've, as far as I know, have come and gone. Um, Probably because a lot of times they run into a situation where they want to be part of the in group, because there is definitely in groups. There's a
Oh
couple.
yeah.
Yeah, there's a couple in groups. It's not a single group, but they want to be a part of one of those groups. They go and they come with their opinions that they've gotten from either Reddit, Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube, or wherever. They go there and they just hit a wall. Or alternatively, there's been examples where in groups have kind of really clowned on someone pretty hard. Like, basically discover that there's a source of information being put out there, because when these people come into the groups, they're like, well, where did you hear that from? And then they find out where they heard it from, and then they go to the source, and then they clown on the source, um, because kind of like, well, if you stop it at the source, it's going to
Right.
stop entirely.
And I will say, you're welcome to try with us, but it's not going to work. Like, you're not going to be able to bully us into supporting clones or something. Like, that's just it's ridiculous. I know. That's why I chose that one, because it's such a
and it's done.
It's time to end it all.
Cut them off.
But yeah, so it's and I would say to anybody who is new in the community, like, don't let, like, you unfortunately will encounter a lot of people who want to make you, like, fit their mold of what's acceptable, and have confidence in yourself. Like, don't play that game, because if you don't play that game, it's like, just the way to win is just to not play, because, you know, otherwise you're stuck sucking up to these people or trying to please them. It's like, don't do that. Do what you think is fun.
And this ties into battle songs as well. Do keep, I mean, battle songs in terms of when you're making choice about what battle song you might want to buy. There's plenty of people reviewing stuff out there with plenty of opinions, but knowing the information, even if you don't listen to like half of what we said, just knowing these different things to look out for will help you make more educated decisions about a battle song to buy for flipping.
Right. Don't listen to just us, for the love of God, when it comes to.
Mean, you could, but
right. No, listen to only us. If anybody disagrees, let us know so we can go deal with the problem.
Yeah, at the source, please.
Yeah.
No, it allows you to make more educated decisions, because a lot of times people don't even consider that some of these people you're supposed to disclose. You're supposed to. And some do, some don't. Certain agreements you have with companies to promote a certain product. And if you don't know this, you can end up listening to someone who their words sound great, their ideas sound great, and then when you actually look into it a bit more, you're like, hey, wait a minute, they're being paid to say this, they're getting free product to say this. Hey, when I actually compare this knife to another one, this don't add up.
Right.
So these are hopefully these podcasts at least can offer that as well, where get the mind thinking about what you're looking for, why you're looking for it, and so on.
Now, I will say we're closing in on like 2 hours and 40 minutes. So I think it's probably best if we just save the EDC discussion for a future one.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah. But, you know, even if we never get to it or whatever, like, it's you can figure out what you want with what we've already made. So
And it could even be part of a shorter discussion because I feel like the EDC, there's not as much to go over. There's
Balance point doesn't matter as much.
I mean, less people use it, I would argue. I feel like there's more collectors than there are EDC guys that use battle songs. That might be a wild statement, but somehow, or at least the collector owns way more battle songs. Like the 5 or 10 collectors that are ridiculous collectors definitely own way more battle songs than probably every EDC guy combined for battle songs, unless they're also a flipper.
Well, I definitely think the flippers represent the minority in the market, you know, which I think is why it's like people are upset at Benchmade for some of the decisions that they make. But you have to remember that, like, they're making fantastic knives for their target audience, right? Like, it's not, their target audience is not necessarily flippers, right? Because they need to have a successful business, right? And so,
Well, this is actually this is what, and I do want to let me let you finish that point. Sorry, I'm sorry.
no. Yeah, you better be sorry.
Oh.
But basically, just keep in mind that the reason that a company might not be making something the way that you guys would expect or would consider to be best is because the flippers are probably the minority in the market.
Yeah, and that's kind of where I was going with that. Where, but it's unfortunate because it's a two-part problem where the community didn't understand what the company was trying to do, and in some ways, a company didn't know what that community's preferences were changing towards. So I definitely think it's on both sides where if the community has expectations that don't measure up, it can have some serious backlash just considering how small the community is. And I think part of it is because around 2015 or whatnot, the demand for good flippers just went up pretty rapidly.
Hugely.
It got
Bigly.
Yeah, and I think it probably had a lot to do with the YouTube videos. Like I think of Calvin Nation, Cutlery Lover, not too much. He didn't really he did tricks, but they weren't like breakdowns of like hard technical tricks. Vincent Dark, or is that his? No, that's, I don't know if his channel is Vincent Dark or if it's Byte Handle. He did a lot of tutorials, and I feel like these tutorials opened up a whole new world for demand. Where before the companies were probably like, "Hey, if it flips well, it flips well. If it's a cool knife, cool. If it is only good for an EDC, so be it." And then you move into all these videos, and the demands change. And then even in some ways, this even affects like what is a good EDC battle song? Can a battle song be both a good EDC and a flipper? It raises questions like that a company, I imagine, tries to answer or is trying to answer.
Right. And so I think it is people, I guess the main point of that is just keep in mind that the criteria for what makes a battle song good to you might not match the criteria that the company has. Now that, and this is shameless self-advertising, right? But my goal with my stuff is specifically for it to be good for flippers. Like the flippability takes priority over virtually anything else. And so it's like, yeah, it's a different situation if I make something and it doesn't flip well, right? Because I'm not designing it to be sold in Walmart or whatever, right?
And
Like,
you're communicating it too. So and that definitely goes a long way. Communicating what the expectation is so that when people when it comes time for them to make their own conclusions about it, they at least have a baseline.
Right. And they know that I'm listening to what they say, even if the eventual decision that I make is not what they think would be completely the best. It's at least not far off.
Exactly.
Because you have to pick somewhere. Like, if you're getting a bunch of different feedback from a bunch of different people, like, you eventually have to pick a design, right? And it, for the most part, you can't have a knife that just magically changes weight, you know, depending on who buys it, right? Unless you have really bad tolerances, then I suppose it does change.
Pieces start falling off.
Yeah. Was this supposed to come with a blade?
Oh no.
Yeah, and I guess now is a good. We are calling our ballast song discussions. The series is called Two Handles, One Blade. You know, no innuendo there at all or anything.
Not to be mistaken with another.
Yeah, you know, like liquid containing things or whatever. But yeah, so that we will be we're arranging it so that there's going to be organized stuff on the channel, you know, different playlists and stuff for people to hopefully more easily find what they want to watch.
Yep. So when we start getting into some more knife-based, well, more knife-based content, battle songs are knives. Content.
No, they're gang weapons. That's what they are.
Oh no. But when we get into content that isn't ballad song focused, we at least can have playlists that reflect those discussions.
Yeah, we'll need a playlist that's why titanium is better than everything else.
And it's just a video of 10 minutes of silence.
Yeah, yeah. Or it's just, it is. And then the video ends. But yeah, so. Yeah, and people are asking like what we have planned. Well, this guy's asking for the name of the future bally y'all are planning. We're not really planning a bally. He's helped me with the bally that I'm designing and manufacturing, and I'm calling it the Spitfire, named after the plane. But yeah, as far as for the future of the podcast, we will be having guests on, but we've already picked out sort of the guests that we want and stuff. So we're just picking out a time when those people would be able to come on, you know, what they would be able to talk about, or want to talk about, you know, but it would be cool to get people from with different specialties, like whether it's like a medical professional or someone who's a lawyer or similar things. Just getting their insight would be kind of cool.
Agreed. Definitely agree on that.
So I think that's that. We will have some, we'll get some segments and highlights up for you guys if you ended up wanting to rewatch any of this. So yeah. I think we're good to go.
Yeah, it was a great talk. I enjoyed this one.
Alrighty, later guys.
Have a good one.